welcome to our 5th Tiny Tom Talk about oak reproduction in a nutshell. We're here with research ecologist Tom Simpson, and do you want to do any introductory remarks before we jump into the questions?
No, I mean, I could talk about oak reproduction for the next 5 hours, so I don't really want to start on that. Only it's something that I've been fascinated with for a long time, and for the last 10 years, been doing various small experiments and field projects and other things related to oak reproduction. So I'm anxious to get going today.
Awesome. So what is actually happening when an acorn is planted?
So, first of all, Jackie's going to ask me some questions, but that doesn't mean that the rest of you could come in with a question at any point. That's not impolite. We're going to try to do this for the next 15 minutes in a sort of conversational format. And if you stop me on a question, that's great, because that's what happens when I'm teaching indoors, in person, that people ask questions I can't answer. That's just naturally human conversation. So don't feel if you think it's a difficult question, ask it anyway. So I mean, when an acorn is planted, I mean, the acorn is the fruit of an oak tree. So if you take it apart, there's a shell on the outside. That's the ovary wall. Inside of that is the meat of the acorn. But if you look between the two, there's a very thin little dark brown skin, and that's the seed coat that's left. Inside that, those big white thing are the two cotyledons, this seed leaves of this embryo in there, and the seed leaves are what store the food energy for the developing embryo if it starts to grow, and the embryo is at the tip of the acorn, away from the cap. So when an acorn is planted, that embryo, it has a cold treatment over winter, and then that embryo breaks dormancy and starts to grow. And the first thing you'll see above ground is a tiny little shoot with what look like tiny little oak leaves. It's very different from something like a garden pea that you plant that actually lifts its cotyledons above ground. And you see these two green flaps on that first stem. No, the cotyledons in an oak stay below ground in the acorn and serve as a food storage organ for the developing embryo to seedling. And so the first thing you see above ground is a shoot with true leaves on it, and that will, develop and grow up for probably just a few inches tall that first year. So that's in a nutshell, sort of physiologically what's happened. That seems to happen pretty naturally, and I can collect acorns and stratify them in the refrigerator over winter in some wet sand, and sure enough, they germinate and they'll start to grow. If you could plant them in your garden, you could plant them anywhere, and as long as you keep animals from eating them, they'll start to grow. So if there is an issue with oak reproduction, it's not in that sort of basic physiological process. That seems to be happening now, just as it has probably since the evolution of oak trees hundreds of thousands of years ago.
So is there any issue with oaks reproducing on their own, or why are we planting so many trees? Just curious.
Well, the tree planting is, if we understood perfectly how to create opportunities for oak reproduction, which we don't today. But even if we could create those situations, but we might need to wait 5 or 10 years to actually get the reproduction. Oaks aren't necessarily going to operate on our time scale. So conservation district, like a lot of, businesses, and we're not for profit, public not for profit, but still you have a project, you want to get it going. You want to, rather than waiting for 3 generations of oak to work their way out into a field over the next century, you want to plant the field. So planting trees is a technique for quickly reforesting an area. We get our acorn sources locally, so it's the genetics of the tree are for the most part McHenry County genetics or close by. But there is an underlying problem, and I can just let me. I think the best demonstration of that is this. Everyone can see this now, correct? Okay, that's
Yeah, sorry.
that's
I
that's
gotta
a
share the
study.
screen.
Not okay. I forgot. I remembered everything except actually sharing the screen. There you go. Okay, now
There we go.
isn't as pretty as it would be. That's fine. All I want you to look at this graph. This is a bar chart. So the height of the bars is the number of stems per acre, or the density of stems. So a tall bar means there's lots of stems between 12 and 15 inches in diameter, more stems between 15 and 18 inches in diameter here, and then they taper off. And they're the black bars. So if you look down here, the black bars are the number of oaks that I found in 2019. This is in Glacial Park, in the woodlands of Glacial Park, just south of the visitor center. And this is the light bars are the number of oaks that were found 33 years before. I think that would have been 1986. So you can see a change in oak population over a 33-year period. And what this is telling you is that there are very few small oak trees out there today. Many fewer trees in the 9 to 12-inch class now than there were 33 years ago. Likewise with the 12 to 15-inch class and the 6 to 9-inch class. So they're very few young oaks. These oaks here have now aged, and some of them have died, and so this sort of bell curve has moved to the right and will continue to shift to the right and get smaller as that cohort of trees age. So what this distribution is saying is that there's no replacement at the bottom here, or very little replacement at the bottom. The trees are growing older. You can still walk in Glacial Park. There are lots of big, beautiful oak trees around. It doesn't seem like they're rare. They're not rare, but this tells you that they're not reproducing adequately to replace themselves, because this little black bar, those trees, as they get older, that bar doesn't get taller. They're just trees. They're trees that started growing, 30, 40 years ago, at least. And so these the next curve will be out here, and it will be lower and lower and lower as those trees move to the right, or get older and larger. So what this graph shows you is that reproduction in the oak woods of Glacial Park have not been adequate for the older trees to replace themselves. So I thought that would be useful just to see that rather than have me tell you, and that's not unusual. I did a similar study in Marengo Ridge Conservation Area, very similar result. You could look at oak woods all over the county and usually see that. I mean, they're always, when you study nature, you study variety, and so you can find places where oaks have reproduced. It's not always easy to figure out why they did in one place and not in another, but the general case is that particularly white oaks are not replacing themselves very well today, and in many cases, like in Glacial Park, they're hardly replacing themselves at all as they get older. It's quite natural that the older trees are dying. I mean, not always people can do things to kill trees, but they're going to die. It's a matter of whether they're being replaced at the bottom end by young trees. So I guess the answer to that is yes, there is a problem. We have time to fix it, but the problem is there.
So in theory, oaks are gonna live a really long time, maybe for centuries. And in that case, you'd really only need just one oak to survive after all that time to replace the one that passed away. Um, would it make sense then that there'd be very few seedlings at any point in time?
That's a That's a good question. Actually asked Jackie to ask that question because it's a question I've gotten several times in oak presentations. Because there's a logic to it that if a tree, oak trees can live 400 years, therefore, a 400-year-old oak would only have to create one little tree that would grow to be 400 years, and the woods would always be the same. But that's not really the way populations work. I mean, again, I'm going to show you a forget what I was doing here. And now if I go to here, publisher, and no, that's not what I'm just going to show you this. This is this is a population distribution of
I'm
this
sorry.
curve here. I'm sorry. I thought I remembered this time, but I didn't.
We had a long morning setup of a lot of Festival of Sugar Maple things today, so thank you for your
I get
patience.
so lost on this. Okay, we're screen
There we go.
share, and then I can. There I go. So this is a distribution. This funny curve. Um, this is the size of the population, much like the last bar chart. And this is the age of the trees. And what it's telling you is that seedlings, there are many, many, many trees. In this particular example, I made this curve up. It's, 200 seedlings per acre at year one. There are now 37 trees per acre at between 10 and 30 years old, 29 trees per acre, 30 to 100 years old, 19 trees per acre from 100 to 250 years old, and 4 trees more than 250 years old. I'm not saying this is exactly the population age distribution of oak stands. It isn't, because it's really lacking in this younger part, but I just present it as an example. You can look at any amount of literature out there, and this is how plant populations work. Many young, few old. I mean, this has been the basic understanding of population biology since Charles Darwin really revolutionized our way of looking at nature 170 years ago now. So what this says is that rather than few young trees, there should be many, because almost all of them are going to die before they get old. There will be a few trees that reach 200, 300, maybe even 400 years old, but there will be 1 in 1,000 trees that get old. All the rest of them will have died before they get old. And so you always need lots of young trees in a population, because most of those are going to die. That's just how plant populations work. And so it's not, it might make sense to think that a tree would only need to make one seedling, but the likelihood that one seedling would live to be 400 years old is like 1 in a million. So you would need 1 million seedlings in order to have one by the time it got to be 400 years old. So that's the basic answer to the question. This is just basic population biology that yeah, what we're missing out there is we're missing all those young oaks that we need to have, because most of them won't get to be grand old oaks that we love to look at. So let me stop share again.
When I first started at the district, I noticed a lot of people kept giving you squirrels or stuffed animals, and it had something to do with your research. So what do squirrels and blue jays have to do with oak reproduction?
You know, this is it's a funny question, because from the time you were in grade school, you learned about squirrels and acorns, didn't you? Everyone does. Squirrels collect acorns and they carry them around. They bury them. If you've got I mean, squirrels in my backyard are generally carrying pieces of pizza and and stuff they get out of the dumpsters nearby. But squirrels are gathering and caching animals. Many rodents are. Mice will do it to some extent. You know, if you heaven forbid get rats in your house, they'll collect food and stash it in places in your house. So rodents do that. Blue jays are food cachers, and so as they cache acorns, in particular animals that cache acorns in the surface soil become instrumental in the reproduction and dispersal of oaks. There's no other, I mean, an oak acorn, when it drops out of a tree, just goes straight down. The wind isn't going to blow it more than a foot or two from a 50 or 60-foot height. So the only way oaks can disperse and colonize nearby areas is with the help of animals. And so it's squirrels and jays that are the key dispersal aids. Those are principal ones. I mean, squirrels includes fox squirrels, gray squirrels, flying squirrels, chipmunks, which is a ground squirrel, really cache acorns, but they cache them in their burrow below ground, so they're not really in a position to germinate and grow into a tree there. So they're essential animals to the reproduction of oak trees. I think without those, and much of my research was or has been, about they're still out there. Blue jays and squirrels are still out there, but why do they not seem to be planting oaks out into fields near oak trees? Why are there not oak trees popping up next to mature oaks all the time? And that really isn't the case. Every once in a while they do, but you can go to lots of places in Glacial Park and walk around the edges of the oak woods in the prairies and not see a single seedling. So something was interrupting that. And so I started doing research on squirrels. I even radio collared squirrels, taught myself how to just imagine putting a radio collar around a squirrel's neck. That's not easy. And then following them through the succeeding couple of years to find out where they were going and what kind of areas they were avoiding. So after that, everyone I was the butt of all sorts of squirrel jokes for years. So that's the reason why.
We had a question in the chat. Are there other environmental factors, even less open space, that could account for the decline of oaks?
Well, there are lots of environmental factors that are affecting oaks or affecting oaks. There are. I was just reading a paper of one of our volunteers sent to me on, I think it was Phytophthora, several species of Phytophthora root fungus that contribute to the mortality of oaks. There's oak wilt, which is less of a problem on white oaks and bur oaks, more of a problem on hills oaks and red oaks. There's a oak blight that's been a problem with oak trees. Various wood rotting fungi that can get into an oak that's injured. I mean, historically, fires killed. I mean, I know all ecologists like me are always telling you that oaks are fire resistant, and they are. They're more fire resistant than other trees, but it doesn't mean fire doesn't kill them. Sometimes it just kills them less often than it kills elms and maples and cherries and other trees. And so competitively, the oaks are advantaged by fire, even though the individual tree may be injured fire. Anytime you open up a wound on a tree, it can be infected by organisms. It's not that, and some of those are novel influences, some of the particularly influences where people are living, people putting a driveway in next to the house and cutting the roots of an oak tree. There's lots of things that can kill an oak tree. My point to that would be that we need to minimize that to the extent that we can. Some things we can't control, but the real problem is we're not replacing those older oak trees with young oak trees. We're managing woods in ways that don't seem to allow periodic replacement, and that's the issue that we need to get better at. It's not a crisis; it's just something we need to get better at over the next few decades.
And there's still time to put questions in the chat. I have one more question planned for Tom, but feel free to keep adding your questions.
Either that or I'll just keep talking forever. So if you're going to ask.
So one thing I've heard you talk about recently was that, it's not always clear where the end of one individual tree is, where a new genetic individual begins. So do all acorns have the same genes?
Oh, all right. Well, I guess obviously, I mean, acorns from two oak trees sitting next to one another, they will have a different genetic composition, just like Jackie and I are genetically distinct. We're both human beings, and so you would find a lot of similar genes in all human beings because we're all human. But there are certain genes that like code for facial characteristics that every slight variation we see it's an obvious feature. Those are distinct between individuals, and the same with oak trees. What the point I was making was one of the Tom Talks last year or the year before is that I try to make this a not a belabored genetic explanation, but in a developing human being, the cells that will eventually become either sperm or eggs are sequestered very early as the human embryo develops. And they're essentially exactly the same as the genes your mother and father gave you. So any mutations that happen as your body grows, and mutations aren't always bad things, but they're not represented in sperm and eggs. plants are very different because an oak tree is creating flowers every single year at the tips of the twigs that grew out the year before. And so all the mutations that occur in the growth of an oak tree or any plant, it's most obvious with trees, any mutation that occurs as the tree grows is then passed on from one twig to the next, to the next, to the next. And it shows up as actually a diversity of genetics from a single oak tree will have many, at least small differences in the genetics of those acorns. And so it's fascinating because that means that oaks can or trees can evolve much faster than we thought they could initially. When you think of a 400-year-old tree that only every 400 years it could, have a natural selection sort of influence. No, it happens every year. A twig that's defective in some ways doesn't contribute viable acorns. A twig that is more vigorous contributes more acorns. And so there's always that sort of internal selection within a tree that's going on. The closer you look at nature, the more complicated and more beautiful I think it gets. But it's simple answer to that question would be no, they're not all the same, Jackie.
There's never simple answers to these
That's what I
questions.
usually answer when you ask me a question in the truck. I just say no, and I don't say anything more.
We had a question in the chat about management techniques. Are there any management techniques that should change to help with oak reproduction? For example, would annual burns impact the very young oaks?
I guess there's two questions there. One is that from this, again, this is taking a big shortcut here. The sort of the bottom line of the research I did over about a 10-year period was discovering that jays and squirrels will plant acorns. They'll pick out places to plant acorns where there's very little vegetation or where the vegetation is very short, which might seem like an arbitrary choice, but it's not arbitrary at all because where there's very little ground vegetation or the vegetation is very short, mice populations are very low. And mice are one of the principal predators of acorns once they're planted in the ground. Believe me, I've planted hundreds and hundreds of acorns over the years and gone back to find out mice eating them. And so what jays and squirrels are doing is picking out little microhabitats where it's more likely that their stored food will be there to eat, because that's what they're going to rely on. And if you stored all your food in tall grasses, then the mice would all eat it and you'd starve to death in the winters. So jays and squirrels have figured that out and are planting acorns in areas where there's very little ground vegetation. So one of the things, again, it wasn't easy for me to come up with that conclusion. It was easy for me to say it, even if you used a management policy like fall burning. Fall burning would create broad areas where there's very little ground vegetation adjacent to oak trees. That should stimulate acorn caching by squirrels and jays. Could be the grazing animals in the past where we're creating you can look at our bison pasture down at Pleasant Valley where the bison have grazed it down to the nub. I mean, that would be ideal habitat for jays to plug acorns in the ground. So that part of it, I think, is integrating types of management that sporadically here and there create those ideal situations for jays and squirrels to plant acorns. Question about fire is one that has come up many times. Fire will typically kill most small woody plants back to the ground. Anyone who's conducted prescribed fires can tell you that. By the time a tree gets up to an inch or two in diameter, it's a little more iffy about whether it will be killed back to the ground. So what we do know is if you allow a woods to become full of buckthorn and honeysuckle and black cherry and elm and not so much ash trees anymore, but you can think of any number of hardwood trees that basically fill in under oaks and create a very shady environment, that without fire or other systematic disturbance, no oak trees are going to grow because they need sunlight. And so it's obviously a balance of fire, I think, periodic mass reproduction of oaks, and the survival of a few. To me, that's the work. As an ecologist, that seems to me the working model. is that when reproduction happens, it happens in very large numbers. Most of those seedlings never survive to become large trees, but a few of them do, just a few, and that's all you need to maintain a, a sort of barren oak savanna environment. Many of the oaks will stay shrubs, some of them will die, just a few of them will grow up into larger trees. So fire has very much a place in oak woods management. We're still trying to figure it out, basically. If anyone acts like they know what they're doing, then they must be lying to you, because we can't know what we're doing. We've been doing this for 30 years. It may take another 30 or 40 years. I mean, in an oak tree's lifetime, that's not a lot of time. Seems like a lot of time to you and me, but so we have a lot more to learn about that, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
I have one last question. It was actually emailed to us before this. How do oaks
Okay.
determine if it's a mast year? Is it like an individual
Well,
tree or a whole oak grove?
it's a good question. I mean, part of the answer to that question, I don't think anyone knows. What seems obvious with oaks is that there's, I'll say the reason why trees mast, I think, is pretty well understood. We can't ask a tree, and they can't talk, so they can't tell us, but it seems obvious that if you created the same number of acorns every year, pretty soon predator populations would build up to a level that they would eat the acorns every year, and there wouldn't be anything left over. And so creating abundant crops one year and very little the next year makes sense, but not every other year, because every other year then an insect predator would just evolve to be an every other year predator, like, well, any sort of regular cycle. So oak trees are sort of erratic. There'll be anywhere from 2 to 5 year intervals between these mass seed crops, but there's some sort of timer in the oak tree that means that they're not going to create abundant crops one year after another. But there are also environmental influences that can trigger that. Again, it's not well understood. There are lots and lots and lots of things in nature that are not very well understood, because nature does them just fine without our understanding them. And and no one's going to make $1 million by understanding it. And so we don't spend any time trying to understand it. So exactly what causes sap to rise in a sugar maple tree, or exactly what causes the masting phenomenon in oaks, is only poorly understood. But we do know that there are environmental influences, and there is an internal mechanism in the tree. There may be ways that trees communicate. I mean, there are mycorrhizal networks that connect trees together. That's a sort of popular explanation these days. Might be true. There are also hormones that are released into the air that can easily move through a stand of oaks and trigger other oaks to release the same chemical, and all those things are sending the same message. There are various ways that trees can communicate, but in a mast year, most of the trees of that species will produce abundant acorns, not all of them. And in a down year, most of the trees won't produce very many acorns, but a few will. I mean, so it's not like coordinated dancers. They aren't all doing one thing or all doing another, but certainly in a mast year, most of the trees are producing abundant acorns. And in a down year, most of them are producing very, very few acorns. And there are a few trees that, they don't read the memo and are on their own time schedule. Well, since I've been collecting acorns for over 10 years now, that it becomes obvious where I can look and to see if I can find any acorns that year. And it's obvious when you're looking. You can look up in the tree, and in a mast year, you can see the acorns hanging there before they fall. And when you can't see any, it's going to be a pretty poor year. So yeah, bur oaks and white oaks, because those are the ones I collect most often in Glacial Park. It's probably 2 to 5 years, I would say, between mast years. And all mast years aren't the same. Some years it's like walking on a gravel road under a tree, and other years it's just a lot of acorns. So
Great.
I guess I've been going on for a half hour now, so.
Well, we're just about out of time, so thank you all for joining us. You are welcome to check out the recordings of this and our other Tom Talks, including our Tiny Tom Talk series on the @DiscoverMCCD channel, on our YouTube channel. There is a Tom Talks playlist. So we hope to see you next week for our last one.
And I'd love to get questions about oak trees, so you can email me any question about oak trees any time of year. And I'll enjoy answering.
All right. Have a great day.
So long for now.